I spent my whole life tracking predators and debunking campfire myths, convinced the vanishing elk in Devil's Chimney were just the work of a smart bear. But when I rigged a 35mm camera to an infrared tripwire in the spring of '94 to prove it, the film I developed didn't just shatter my skepticism, it forced me to lock the greatest biological discovery of the century inside a fireproof safe forever. I'm going to tell you the true story of the night. I captured a 9-foot giant shielding its child in the freezing rain. Before we head into the darkroom, drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from today. And if you want to uncover more hidden stories about Bigfoot and the deep woods, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Spring of 1994 started with a mystery I was determined to solve with cold, hard facts. I've always been a hobbyist tracker, the kind of guy who trusts footprints and scat over campfire stories. I lived on the edge of a vast, unbroken tract of timber, a place where local legends grew faster than the pine trees. People in town always whispered about the wild man, but I had zero patience for folklore. I believed in biology, in apex predators like cougars and rogue black bears, not mythical giants. But something was systematically clearing out the local elk herds every single summer. The locals blamed the vanishing elk on everything from UFOs to mountain spirits, but I knew there had to be a logical, flesh and blood explanation. The activity was localized to a jagged, unforgiving drainage on the northern edge of my property, known as Devil's Chimney. It was a topographical nightmare. Steep rock walls, dense underbrush, and perpetually shadowed by the surrounding peaks. Hunters avoided it, because hauling a carcass out of that ravine was nearly impossible, making it the perfect sanctuary for a smart predator. I decided it was time to bring a little scientific rigor to the local ghost stories. I wasn't going to rely on fuzzy eyewitness accounts or plaster casts of melted snow. I dug into my savings and bought a high-end, weather-sealed 35mm film camera, the kind used by professional wildlife photographers. It was a heavy mechanical beast that didn't rely on fragile digital sensors that could freeze or glitch. I spent weeks modifying it in my workshop, stripping away the unnecessary components to make it as rugged as possible. I wanted a machine that could sit in the freezing rain for a month and still fire the shutter when the time came. The real challenge was the trigger mechanism, as commercial trail cameras were practically non-existent in the mid-90s. I rigged a primitive but highly sensitive infrared tripwire, calculating the exact height to ignore deer and coyotes. I wanted the big game, the apex predator that was dragging 300-pound elk into the shadows of the chimney. I packed the rig into a canvas duffel, along with enough chemical desiccants to keep the lens clear of the pervasive mountain fog. I was setting a technological trap for a biological ghost, entirely confident I'd catch a bear. The hike into Devil's Chimney took 4 grueling hours of bushwhacking through Devil's Club and Deadfalls. The air in the drainage was noticeably colder, carrying the damp metallic scent of undisturbed earth and rotting cedar. I found a natural choke point, a narrow game trail flanked by sheer granite on one side and a sheer drop on the other. It was a perfect funnel, forcing anything moving through the ravine to pass within 10 feet of a massive, hollowed-out hemlock stump. I mounted the camera inside the stump, camouflaging the housing with moss and bark. I spent another 2 hours meticulously aligning the infrared beam across the trail, ensuring the geometry was flawless. I tested the trigger 3 times by throwing a heavy log through the invisible beam, listening for the satisfying mechanical clack of the shutter. I loaded a fresh roll of high-speed black and white film, capable of capturing crisp images, even in the low-light conditions of the deep woods. I locked the housing, wiped my fingerprints off the lens, and took a final look around the silent, brooding ravine. I felt the smug satisfaction of a hunter who has perfectly laid his snare. For the next 3 weeks, I stayed away from the northern edge of the property entirely, letting the woods settle back into their natural rhythm. The waiting was an exercise in pure discipline, resisting the daily urge to go check the counter and see if the trap had sprung. I occupied my time with mundane chores, chopping wood and fixing fences, but my mind was constantly drifting back to that shadowed choke point. Every time the wind howled down from the peaks, I wondered if my camera was sitting in the crosshairs of a hungry cougar. I was so sure of my own hypothesis. On the 21st day, a massive spring storm rolled through, bringing torrential rain and localized flooding that nearly washed out my access road. I knew the dampness would eventually breach even my weather ceiling, so I grabbed my pack and made the arduous trek back into the chimney. The woods were soaked, dripping with a heavy, oppressive silence that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The game trail was a muddy mess, but as I approached the hemlock stump, my heart began to hammer against my ribs. The camouflage was undisturbed, but the mechanical counter on the side of the housing had moved. It hadn't just fired once or twice. The counter indicated that 14 frames had been exposed on the roll. My initial thought was that a falling branch or a heavy curtain of rain had tripped the sensitive infrared beam repeatedly, but as I crouched in the mud and examined the area, I noticed the distinct lack of debris that would suggest a false trigger. The mud on the trail was churned up, but the heavy rain had washed away any distinct tracks, leaving only smooth, waterlogged depressions. Something large had lingered in front of the lens. I extracted the film canister with the reverence of an archaeologist handling a fragile artifact, sealing it inside a watertight plastic container. I didn't linger in the chimney. The atmosphere felt charged, heavy with an unseen presence that made my rational mind deeply uncomfortable. I hiked back to my cabin at a punishing pace, driven by a burning, obsessive need to see what the machine had witnessed. I had built a makeshift darkroom in my root cellar, complete with chemical trays and a red safe light, specifically for this project. I locked the cellar door behind me, sealing myself in the pitch-black room, with only the dull crimson glow of the safe light to guide my hands. The smell of developer fluid and fixer filled the cramped space, a familiar chemical scent that usually grounded my analytical mind. I threaded the film onto the reel strictly by touch, my fingers trembling slightly, despite my best efforts to remain objective. I told myself I was about to look at a very large, very muddy black bear, but my gut was telling a completely different story. I submerged the reel into the developer tank, setting the timer and beginning the methodical agitation process that would bring the latent images to life. The minutes stretched out into an agonizing eternity, the ticking of the clock echoing loudly in the silent subterranean room. I poured out the developer, added the stop bath, and finally the fixer, my anticipation building to a fever pitch. I opened the tank, pulled the dripping strip of negatives out into the red light, and reached for my magnifying loupe, completely unaware that my reality was about to fracture. I hung the dripping strip of negatives from the wire above the sink, the sharp metallic smell of the fixer burning my nostrils. The red safe light cast long, bloody shadows across the concrete walls of the cellar, turning the small room into an isolation chamber. My heart was beating an erratic rhythm, the anticipation fighting against my deeply ingrained skepticism. I grabbed my magnifying loupe, completely ready to find the blurry snout of a black bear or the sleek flank of a cougar to vindicate my entire worldview. I slid the glass over the first few frames, squinting in the dim crimson light. Blank. Just the hollow hemlock stump and the empty, rain-slicked game trail. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding, assuming the infrared trigger had simply caught a falling branch or a sudden shift in the barometric pressure from the storm. A wave of cynical disappointment washed over me. This was the mundane reality of field research, a lot of waiting for a whole lot of nothing. I moved the loupe to the fourth frame, and the stark emptiness was gone. There was a massive dark shadow dominating the edge of the lens, a blur of motion that had triggered the shutter too late for a clear subject. It was far too close to the camera to make out any identifying features, but the sheer volume of the mass was undeniable. It completely eclipsed the background foliage, blocking out the ferns and the granite wall behind it. I held my breath, sliding the loupe carefully down to the fifth frame. The fifth frame was perfectly centered, the focus razor-sharp thanks to the high-speed film and the heavy mechanical shutter. But it took my brain several long, agonizing seconds to actually process the geometry of what I was looking at. It wasn't a bear dropping down onto all fours, and it certainly wasn't a cougar slinking through the wet underbrush. It was a massive, upright, bipedal leg, caught perfectly frozen by the flash in the middle of a powerful stride. My rational mind instantly threw up its defenses, screaming that I was looking at an elaborate hoax. I figured some local teenagers had found my setup, dressed up in a cheap matted gorilla suit, and decided to play a prank on the town's resident skeptic. I leaned in closer, my eye practically pressing against the cold glass of the loupe, desperately searching for the telltale signs of a zipper. I looked for seams, for the way synthetic fur sags unnaturally around the ankle of a human wearer. There were no seams to be found. Instead, I saw the unmistakable, terrifying topography of living, breathing anatomy. The thigh was gargantuan, the muscles corded and deeply defined, bulging beneath a thick layer of dark, wet hair. It was a limb built for explosive, unyielding power, meant to carry a physical weight that would instantly crush a normal human hip joint. The hair didn't hang loosely like a costume. It grew organically, following the natural contours of the dermis underneath. The detail that finally and permanently shattered my skepticism was the foot itself. It was planted firmly in the mud of the trail, captured at the exact microsecond of weight transfer. I could clearly see the deep flexion of the mid-tarsal break, the extreme splay of the toes as they gripped the slick earth for traction. A man in a suit, wearing oversized foam feet, simply cannot replicate that dynamic biological tension. The biomechanics playing out on the negative were completely flawless. I pulled away from the film strip, my hand shaking so violently that I nearly dropped the loop onto the concrete floor. The small cellar suddenly felt freezing cold, and the air felt too thin to breathe. I had spent my entire adult life mocking and debunking the exact creature that was currently burned into the silver halides of my film. The wild man of the high ridges wasn't a campfire myth meant to scare tourists. It was my neighbor. I forced myself to look through the glass again, trying to desperately calculate the scale of the animal. I knew for a fact that the camera housing was mounted exactly 3 feet off the ground in the hemlock stump. In the photograph, the massive knee joint of the striding leg was perfectly level with the center of the lens. I did the math in my head, the resulting numbers terrifying me far more than the image itself. The creature attached to this leg easily stood over 8 feet tall. The sheer biological reality of the image was entirely staggering to me. This wasn't just some undiscovered ape wandering the Pacific Northwest. Apes don't possess the bipedal striding mechanics clearly shown in this frame. The locked knee, the forward momentum, the incredibly upright posture. It was distinctly hominid. It was a massive, unknown primate, navigating the treacherous terrain of Devil's Chimney with the practiced, effortless ease of an apex resident. I stared at that single frame until my vision blurred, the implications rewriting every single rule of the natural world I thought I understood. I was standing in a damp basement, holding the holy grail of biology in my trembling hands, entirely alone with the greatest discovery of the century. But the mechanical counter on the camera had read 14 exposures when I pulled it from the woods. There were still 9 frames left on the wet strip, waiting in the dark to be examined. I wiped a layer of cold sweat from my forehead, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird desperate to escape. I slid the loop down the strip of film, moving past the massive leg to see what else had triggered the sensor that rainy night. I aligned the glass carefully over the 8th frame, bracing myself for another look at the solitary giant, completely unprepared for the smaller shadows trailing right behind it. I moved the loop down the dripping strip of negatives to the 8th frame, my hands trembling against the edge of the sink. The red safe light seemed to pulse in time with my racing heartbeat as I leaned closer to the magnifying glass. The image was perfectly exposed, capturing the wide, muddy expanse of the game trail just past the hemlock stump. Striding directly through the center of the frame was the owner of that massive leg, captured in a crisp, moonlit profile. It was a male, a towering mountain of dark muscle and thick, matted hair, moving with an impossible, silent fluidity. He was enormous, possessing a physical architecture that completely defied every biological textbook I had ever studied. His head sat directly on incredibly broad shoulders, completely lacking a discernible neck, with a pronounced sagittal crest pushing up through the fur. The arms hung low, swinging with a heavy, relaxed pendulum motion that ended in hands the size of snowshoes. Despite his terrifying bulk, he didn't look like a lumbering beast. He looked like a seasoned woodsman navigating his own backyard. The sheer, terrifying grace of his movement was burned into the silver halides of the film forever. I was so captivated by the sheer scale of the male that it took me a full minute to notice the lower quadrant. Tucked tightly against the massive striding thigh was a secondary shape, partially obscured by the shadow of the adult. I adjusted the focus on my loop, squinting through the chemical fumes, and felt the floor drop out from under me. It was a juvenile, standing perhaps 4 feet tall, its smaller hand gripping the long, coarse hair of the adult's leg. The smaller figure was looking back over its shoulder, its eyes reflecting the faint ambient light of the flash. The juvenile wasn't a miniature version of the adult. It had the lanky, awkward proportions of a growing child. Its hair was lighter, less dense, and its face held a wide, curious expression that felt sickeningly human to look at. It was clinging to the male with a desperate, familiar grip, seeking comfort and safety in the shadow of its father. They were moving with a shared, synchronized purpose, deeply connected by a bond that transcended mere animal instinct. I was looking at a vulnerable dependent relying entirely on the towering giant leading the way through the rain. My mind spun wildly, trying to reconcile the terrifying monster myths with the tender paternal image resolving under my glass. A solitary beast is an anomaly, a rogue genetic mutation that can be hunted, studied, and eventually dismissed by science. But a family unit changes the entire paradigm. It implies a breeding population, a hidden society existing parallel to our own. It meant they had a lineage, a history, and a future deeply woven into the dark, inaccessible ridges of the Cascades. I was no longer hunting a lone predator. I had stumbled upon a deeply guarded, multi-generational secret. I quickly scanned the next few frames, watching the sequence of their movement unfold across the strip of film. They were heading north, pushing through the dense underbrush with a deliberate, calculated trajectory that ignored the established game trails. That path led directly toward the upper elevations of Devil's Chimney, an area riddled with deep, unmapped limestone caves. It was a region of the mountain so treacherous and remote that even the most experienced local climbers refused to explore it. They were going home, retreating to a subterranean fortress where human eyes had never dared to look. The realization that they lived in those inaccessible caves suddenly explained the vanishing elk herds perfectly. They weren't just killing for a single meal. They were provisioning a hidden colony deeply entrenched in the mountain. The logistics of feeding a family of that size required tactical brilliance and an intimate superior knowledge of the terrain. They were farming the valley, managing the wildlife resources with an efficiency that completely humbled my own tracking skills. We thought we were the masters of this forest, but we were just noisy, ignorant guests walking through their pantry. I pulled the negative strip from the sink and carefully hung it on the drying line, my fingers numb and clumsy. I took a step back, staring at the translucent images dangling in the red glow of the makeshift darkroom. The skepticism that had defined my entire life was dead, entirely replaced by a profound, terrifying sense of awe. I had set out to prove that the woods were empty of magic, only to capture undeniable proof of an ancient, intelligent shadow. The world was suddenly infinitely larger, far more dangerous, and incredibly more complex than I had ever allowed myself to believe. If you're watching this right now, if you believe that the deepest parts of the forest belong to those who were here first, subscribe to the channel. Help me document the true guardians of the high ridges before the rest of the world finds them. Now, let's look closer at the photos. I sat down on a plastic crate, burying my face in my hands, trying to slow the racing thoughts in my head. The discovery was monumental, but it was also incredibly heavy, carrying a suffocating weight of responsibility that I wasn't prepared for. I knew exactly what would happen if I took these negatives to the local university or the state wildlife department. The scientific validation would instantly trigger a violent, unstoppable invasion of their sanctuary, turning the Chimney into a circus. The thought of that curious, lanky juvenile being chased by helicopters and tranquilizer dart guns made my stomach violently churn. I looked back up at the drying negatives, the silhouettes of the father and child swinging gently in the drafty cellar. I realized that my own reaction had shifted fundamentally in the span of an hour, evolving from the thrill of a hunter to a deep, protective empathy. They weren't monsters. They were a family surviving in the harshest conditions imaginable through cooperation, intelligence, and a deep reliance on each other. My desire to expose them was rapidly dissolving, entirely replaced by a terrifying urge to help them remain completely invisible. I grabbed my notebook and a pencil, moving closer to the negatives to study the spatial relationship between the two figures. I needed to understand how they navigated the dense forest while maintaining that incredibly close, physical connection in the dark. As I mapped out their relative positions frame by frame, a stunningly deliberate tactical pattern began to emerge from the sequence. The adult wasn't just leading the juvenile, he was executing a highly specific, calculated maneuver to ensure its absolute survival. I laid the sequential frames out on the light table, moving my loop from one image to the next in chronological order. I was no longer just looking at the sheer size of the creatures, I was intensely focused on the negative space between them. The spatial relationship was dynamic, shifting slightly as they moved down the muddy game trail, but always maintaining a very specific, deliberate distance. The juvenile never strayed more than an arm's length from the adult's massive thigh, anchored to the giant's gravitational pull. It was a choreography born of absolute necessity, a synchronized march through a hostile environment. As I traced their path across the wet earth, a distinct, undeniable pattern began to emerge from the sequence of photographs. In every single frame where the juvenile was visible, the adult male had positioned his immense bulk directly between the young one and the camera. It wasn't a coincidence of the camera angle or a random stumble in the dark. It was a highly calculated, defensive maneuver. The male was actively using his own body as a living, breathing shield against an unknown, unseen threat hidden in the hemlock stump. The geometry of their movement was flawless, demonstrating a level of tactical awareness that completely dwarfed typical animal instincts. A bear will charge a threat or flee in a blind panic, abandoning its young if the danger becomes too overwhelming to fight. But this male was executing a controlled, strategic retreat, constantly adjusting his physical blocking to ensure the juvenile remained entirely in his shadow. He was managing the sightlines of the ravine, acutely aware of where an ambush could originate, treating the glowing infrared sensor like a sniper's laser. I analyzed the angles of the deep drainage, comparing them to the positioning of the two figures in the 14th frame. The male was intentionally hugging the sheer granite wall to his left, effectively cutting off any potential attack vector from that flank. By staying tight to the rock, he forced any potential predator or my hidden camera to face the full, terrifying brunt of his massive right side. It was an advanced military-grade understanding of terrain exploitation, utilized by a creature that supposedly didn't possess the cognitive ability to make fire. The 9th frame on the strip captured a moment that made my chest tighten with a sudden, overwhelming sense of intrusion. The male had stopped dead in his tracks, his massive head turned sharply toward the hollowed-out stump hiding my equipment. The juvenile had instantly frozen behind him, mimicking the sudden, statuesque stillness of its father with terrifying, practiced precision. The male wasn't just looking in the general direction of the lens. His deep-set eyes were locked directly onto the glass, seeing right through my camouflage. It was the 10th frame, however, that completely shattered the remaining fragments of my cold, clinical approach to the photographs. As the male stared down the hidden camera, his massive right hand reached back, completely disappearing into the shadows behind his thigh. The image was slightly blurred from the motion, but the anatomical details were unmistakable as his long, leathery fingers came to rest. He had placed his hand gently but firmly, squarely on the crown of the terrified juvenile's head. That single, simple gesture carried a profound emotional weight that completely defied every metric of modern zoological study I knew. It wasn't a physical correction, and it certainly wasn't a warning strike to demand silence from a noisy, panicked dependent. It was a universal, unmistakably human gesture of comfort, a silent, tactile reassurance that everything was going to be absolutely fine. He was absorbing the child's fear through his fingertips, broadcasting a calming, authoritative presence to keep the juvenile from breaking rank and running. The psychological depth required to execute that kind of emotional regulation in the middle of a perceived threat is staggering. It requires empathy, a complex understanding of another being's internal state, and the conscious decision to prioritize comfort over immediate, violent action. This wasn't a mindless beast reacting to a stimulus in the dark. This was a father protecting his child from the monsters in the woods. The emotional intelligence radiating from the grainy, black and white negative was so incredibly loud that it made my own hands shake. I thought about the timber wolves I had tracked for years and the fierce, brutal ways they protected their den sites. They use aggression, teeth and terrifying numbers to intimidate rivals, acting purely on the raw, ancient dictates of survival and dominance. But nothing I had ever seen in the wild mirrored this quiet, deliberate and fiercely gentle display of emotional armor. The geometry of their protection wasn't just physical, it was deeply psychological, wrapping the juvenile in an invisible, impenetrable blanket of absolute safety. A profound, sickening wave of guilt washed over me as I stared at the frozen interaction illuminated by the red safe light. I had intruded upon their sanctuary, planting a mechanical spy in their living room to satisfy my own arrogant, skeptical curiosity. I was the unseen threat they were reacting to, the invisible predator that had forced this father to shield his young in the rain. My camera wasn't documenting a wild animal. It was actively terrorizing a family, trying to peacefully navigate their way home in the dark. By the 12th frame, the contact was broken, and the pair was moving again, their pace significantly accelerated as they pushed past the stump. The male maintained his flawless blocking technique, never once exposing the juvenile to the lens as they vanished into the dense underbrush of the chimney. They executed the retreat with a silent, ghostly efficiency, leaving nothing behind but deep impressions in the mud and 14 exposed frames of silver halide. They had successfully navigated my trap, proving their absolute mastery over the unforgiving, shadowed terrain of the high Cascade ridges. I sat in the dark room for hours, staring at the physical proof of an impossible reality dangling from a wire above my sink. I knew what I was looking at, but the sheer world-breaking magnitude of the discovery was too heavy for one man to carry alone. My eyes were convinced, my heart was entirely changed, but the stubborn, deeply rooted rationalist inside my brain demanded a second clinical opinion. I needed someone who understood bones, muscles, and movement to look at these negatives and tell me exactly what kind of ghost I had photographed. I brought the negatives out of the darkroom, but the stubborn rationalist inside me refused to surrender completely to what my own eyes had seen. I needed a second opinion, someone completely disconnected from the emotional weight of the discovery and completely immune to the local mountain folklore. In late November of 1994, I packed the film into a secure lockbox and drove 3 hours out of the valley. I was heading to see Arthur Vance, a retired forensic analyst who had spent his long career identifying remains and analyzing complex crime scene photographs. Arthur was a man of hard science, governed entirely by geometry, anatomy, and the cold, unyielding laws of physics. He didn't care about Bigfoot, aliens, or ghosts. He cared about focal lengths, bone density, and the exact angles of articulated joints. I didn't tell him what I thought I had captured in the chimney, only that I needed an expert breakdown of an anomaly on my trail camera. He set up his light table in a dusty, cluttered office, adjusted his thick glasses, and slid the first negative under a heavy brass loop. I sat across from him, my hands sweating, watching his face for the inevitable smirk or the dismissive shake of his head. Instead, Arthur went perfectly still, his breathing shallow as he moved the glass slowly over the striding leg in the 5th frame. He didn't laugh, he didn't call it a hoax, he simply reached for a pair of precise digital calipers and a notebook. For the next 2 hours, the only sound in the room was the scratching of his pencil and the occasional sharp intake of his breath. He started by establishing the baseline metrics, using the known dimensions of the hollowed-out hemlock stump as a fixed point of reference. By triangulating the camera height and the focal length of the 35mm lens, he began to extract the exact physical dimensions of the subject. He measured the femur length, the circumference of the calf, and the extreme angle of the mid-tarsal break on the foot planted in the mud. With every calculation, the lines on his forehead deepened, and his clinical detachment slowly gave way to a profound, quiet bewilderment. "If this is a man in a suit," Arthur finally said, his voice dry and raspy, "he is suffering from a massive, catastrophic skeletal deformity." He pointed the tip of his pencil at the knee joint, explaining how the mechanics of the stride completely defied human locomotion. A human wearing prosthetic extensions to fake that kind of height would suffer an immediate breakdown of their center of gravity. The subject in the photograph was executing a perfectly balanced, forward-leaning walk that required an impossibly massive, non-human pelvis to support the muscular load. He moved to the frames capturing the creature's profile, focusing intensely on the facial structure partially illuminated by the infrared flash. Arthur measured the interpupillary distance, the exact space between the eyes, and compared it to the massive, sloping brow ridge. He explained that a human skull simply cannot fit inside that specific cranial geometry without the eyes looking out through the creature's nostrils. The biological architecture was entirely consistent with a massive, undiscovered hominid, completely ruling out the possibility of a sophisticated Hollywood special effects mask. We calculated the sheer height of the adult male again, running the numbers 3 separate times to ensure there was absolutely no mathematical error. Every single equation yielded the same terrifying result. The creature standing in Devil's Chimney was brushing 9 feet tall and weighed close to 1,000 pounds. Arthur leaned back in his chair, taking off his glasses and rubbing his tired eyes, looking at me with a mixture of awe and deep concern. "Elias," he whispered, "whatever is walking through your woods, it isn't human and it certainly isn't wearing a zipper." Hearing those words spoken aloud by a respected man of science felt like a heavy iron vault slamming shut on my previous reality. The skepticism that had been my armor for decades was completely stripped away, leaving me exposed to a world that was suddenly untamed and terrifying. I had spent my life demanding empirical evidence for the impossible, and now that evidence was sitting on a light table right in front of me. The comforting illusion that humanity had mapped and mastered every inch of the natural world was permanently shattered by a few strips of celluloid. Arthur asked if I was going to publish the findings, noting that these negatives would instantly rewrite every biological textbook currently in print. He warned me that the scientific community would tear the photos apart, subjecting them to endless, ruthless scrutiny before ever admitting they were real. But even more concerning was the physical reaction the public would have once the location of the photographs inevitably leaked to the press. The chimney would be overrun by heavily armed trophy hunters, ambitious academics, and reckless thrill-seekers desperate to bag the ultimate biological prize. I looked down at the image of the massive male placing his hand on the juvenile's head, the gesture of comfort burning into my conscience. To release these photos meant offering that terrified child up to a world that would undoubtedly view it as a monster to be caged or killed. The burden of proof had suddenly morphed into a crushing moral responsibility, a terrifying dilemma that I was entirely unprepared to navigate. I realized that holding the absolute truth in my hands was far more dangerous than living in the comfortable shadows of ignorance. I packed the negatives back into the lockbox, thanking Arthur for his time and swearing him to absolute, unbreakable secrecy regarding what he had seen. The drive back to the cabin was suffocatingly quiet, the dark, towering pines along the highway feeling more like prison bars than a sanctuary. The burden of my shattered skepticism weighed heavily on my chest, a constant reminder that the woods behind my house belonged to an ancient, hidden society. I was no longer a curious tracker investigating a myth. I was the sole custodian of a world-breaking secret that could destroy an entire family. I pulled into my driveway as the sun dipped below the ridges, casting long, menacing shadows across the perimeter of my property. I carried the lockbox into the house, bypassing the darkroom entirely, my mind completely consumed by the gravity of the decision sitting in front of me. The evidence I had desperately sought was now a radioactive liability, a threat to the very creatures I had unwittingly documented in the rain. I walked slowly toward the heavy steel safe bolted to the floor of my study, Knowing that some truths are simply too destructive to see the light of day, I sat the heavy lockbox on my mahogany desk, the metal cold against my palms. The silence of my cabin, once a comforting blanket, now felt charged with a terrifying electricity. I was completely alone with a truth that could upend the scientific establishment and rewrite human history. The physical weight of the film canisters was negligible, but the moral gravity of what they contained was crushing. I looked toward the heavy, fireproof safe bolted to the corner of my study, feeling the impending finality of my next move. That old Diebold safe was originally meant to hold property deeds, a few heirloom watches, and my last will and testament. It was designed to protect the mundane, bureaucratic artifacts of a completely normal, unremarkable human life. It was never intended to serve as a mausoleum for the greatest zoological discovery of the 20th century. I traced the worn numbers on the brass dial, my fingers hesitating over the combination that would seal the truth away forever. I knew that opening the safe meant closing the door on any chance of fame, fortune, or scientific validation. Before I turned the dial, I unlocked the portable box and pulled out the reference prints Arthur had developed. I spread them across the polished wood of my desk, my eyes immediately drawn to the 10th frame. I looked past the massive bulk of the adult male and focused entirely on the terrified, wide-eyed juvenile clinging to his leg. The child's vulnerability was heartbreakingly palpable, radiating a raw, desperate need for the exact protection its father was providing. I realized I was holding the fate of that specific, breathing family directly in my trembling hands. If I took these photographs to a university or a major newspaper, the reaction would be instantaneous and violently catastrophic. Within 24 hours, the local news vans would be clogging the dirt access roads leading to my property. By the end of the week, the sky above Devil's Chimney would be thick with the deafening roar of chartered helicopters. The pristine, silent sanctuary where that family had lived undisturbed for generations would be transformed into a chaotic, terrifying circus. The invasion would be relentless, driven by an insatiable human hunger to conquer and catalogue the unknown. But the media circus was only the first, relatively benign wave of the nightmare I would be unleashing upon them. The true horror would arrive with the heavily armed trophy hunters, the ambitious poachers looking to make a literal fortune. Men with high-powered rifles, thermal scopes, and packs of tracking dogs would flood the treacherous ridges of the Cascades. They wouldn't see a father protecting his child, they would see the ultimate prize, a biological jackpot wrapped in dark fur. The deep, unmapped limestone caves would inevitably run red, with the blood of a completely innocent hidden lineage. Even if the authorities intervened and managed to protect them from the poachers, the humane alternative was equally devastating. The scientific community would mobilize with tranquilizer darts, capture nets, and heavy steel transport cages to secure their new specimens. That terrified juvenile would be ripped away from its father, tagged with a tracking collar, and locked inside a sterile concrete enclosure. They would be subjected to endless blood draws, behavioral tests, and the blinding flashes of a million cameras. They would survive, but their absolute fundamental freedom, the very core of their wild existence, would be completely destroyed. I looked back at the grainy image of the father's hand resting gently on the crown of the juvenile's head. He had risked everything, including exposing himself to my camera, to ensure his child made it safely through the storm. A profound mirroring instinct flared up in my own chest, an overwhelming urge to act as a shield against the coming violence. I couldn't be the catalyst for their destruction. I had to become the quiet, unyielding barrier between their world and ours. It was a moral imperative that completely eclipsed any arrogant desire I had to prove my tracking skills to the world. If you believe that true conservation sometimes requires us to walk away and do absolutely nothing, consider subscribing to this channel. Help me honor the silence that keeps the wild truly wild. Now let's return to the desk. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The hidden world only survives precisely because it remains hidden. The campfire myths, the blurry hoaxes, and the local ridicule were actually their greatest, most effective defense mechanisms. The skepticism that I had so proudly championed was the very armor keeping the poachers and the academics out of the chimney. By proving they were a biological reality, I would be stripping away the protective cloak of the mythical wild man. They didn't need my scientific validation, they desperately needed my continued, unbroken silence. I gathered the prints and the original negatives, my hands no longer shaking with the adrenaline of the discovery. I moved with a calm, deliberate purpose, kneeling on the hardwood floor in front of the heavy steel safe. I spun the brass dial, hitting the 3 numbers of the combination with practiced ease, and pulled the heavy lever. The fireproof door swung open with a smooth, silent glide, revealing the dark, secure interior of the vault. The smell of old paper and cold metal wafted out, a stark contrast to the damp, wild scent of the deep woods. I placed the manila envelope containing the absolute proof of the Sasquatch family onto the bottom shelf, pushing it all the way to the back. I didn't linger or allow myself a second moment of hesitation. I simply stood up and pushed the heavy door shut. The locking bolt slid into place with a loud, authoritative clack that echoed through the quiet space of my study. A massive, suffocating weight instantly lifted from my shoulders, replaced by a profound, enduring sense of relief. The secret was permanently contained, safely locked away from the destructive greed of the modern world. I walked over to the large window overlooking the northern edge of my property, staring out at the darkening tree line. The jagged silhouette of Devil's Chimney was barely visible against the twilight sky, but it no longer looked like a hunting ground. The woods felt entirely different to me now, vibrating with the quiet, intelligent presence of the neighbors I had sworn to protect. I realized that my days of setting traps and chasing ghosts were officially over, replaced by a completely new dynamic. I was stepping into a reality where the forest wasn't just a place to track animals, but a shared, sovereign territory. By the spring of 1995, the snowmelt rushing through Devil's Chimney sounded completely different to my ears. I no longer walked the perimeter of my property with the arrogant, heavy stride of a landowner surveying his domain. I stepped softly, hyper-aware of snapping twigs and the crunch of dry pine needles beneath my heavy boots. The Winchester rifle that used to accompany me on every hike now gathered dust in the corner of my cabin. I had traded the weapon of a hunter for the quiet, respectful demeanor of an uninvited guest in someone else's home. The forest was no longer a resource to be managed or conquered, but a sovereign territory I was permitted to visit. My entire philosophy regarding the wilderness had undergone a massive fundamental inversion over the course of a single winter. I spent my days observing the subtle signs of the ecosystem, no longer looking for tracks to run down and kill. I noticed the snapped branches at the 8-foot mark on the cedar trees, recognizing them not as wind damage, but as territorial markers. I found areas where the underbrush had been carefully, deliberately woven together to create dense, impenetrable blind spots near the game trails. These weren't random acts of nature. They were the intentional, architectural modifications of a deeply intelligent resident species. The landscape was heavily manipulated, engineered by hands that had mastered the environment long before my ancestors ever arrived. I eventually brought the trail camera back out into the woods, but my mission had drastically and permanently changed. I no longer placed the equipment in aggressive choke points, trying to ambush them in their most vulnerable, exposed moments. Instead, I mounted the camera high in the canopy, aiming it at the periphery of the feeding grounds they frequented. I was no longer trying to prove they existed to a skeptical world that would only destroy them for the effort. I had become a silent, distant guardian, using my technology to quietly monitor the general health and movement of the local clan. The camera was my way of checking in on the neighbors without ever knocking on their heavily guarded front door. Over the next few months, I captured fleeting, obscured glimpses of the family unit moving through the deep summer foliage. I never caught another clear, terrifyingly perfect shot like the ones safely locked away in my fireproof Diebold safe. I saw the massive shoulder of the adult male brushing past a fern, or the blurry shape of the juvenile swinging from a low branch. These fragmented images were enough to tell me that the child was growing, thriving in the isolated sanctuary of the high ridges. They were successfully avoiding the logging crews, the summer hikers, and the seasonal hunters that flooded the lower elevations every fall. Their ability to remain entirely invisible while navigating the ever-shrinking cracks of human civilization was a testament to their tactical brilliance. I began to understand that their survival wasn't based on sheer brute strength, but on an incredible, multi-generational discipline. They operated with a strict, unbroken code of silence and evasion, passing this critical survival knowledge down to their young. The juvenile wasn't just learning how to forage or hunt, it was being rigorously trained in the art of absolute stealth. They knew exactly how the prevailing winds carried their scent, and they understood the blind spots in human peripheral vision. We arrogantly assume we are the apex intelligence on this planet, blundering loudly through the woods in bright orange vests. Meanwhile, they watch us from the shadows, effortlessly outmaneuvering our technology and our numbers with a quiet, devastating grace. The elk herd still vanished occasionally, but the mystery no longer filled me with a burning, skeptical frustration. I found a strange, deep comfort in knowing that the natural order of the chimney was functioning exactly as it should. The mountain was providing for its oldest residents, fueling the massive biological engines that kept the deep woods truly wild. I started leaving small, silent offerings near the edge of the deep timber, far away from the prying eyes of my cameras. A block of salt, a pile of late-season apples, things that a massive foraging primate might appreciate during a harsh freeze. I never saw them take the items, but the offerings always vanished without a single, discernible track left behind in the dirt. This silent, unacknowledged barter became a deeply spiritual practice for me, a ritual of coexistence that anchored my solitary life. It was a completely one-sided conversation, but the absence of the apples was all the confirmation I ever truly needed. I was paying a quiet tax to the true landlords of the valley, a gesture of respect from the noisy, hairless neighbor. I stopped talking to the locals about the wild man legends, actively discouraging the campfire stories that drew curious teenagers into the woods. I became the grumpy old hermit who chased people off his land, cultivating a hostile reputation to secure the perimeter. My social isolation was a small willing price to pay to ensure the absolute safety of the family residing in the caves. I spent the long, dark winter evenings sitting by my wood stove, reading old journals and historical accounts of early frontier encounters. I realized that the Native American tribes hadn't written myths. They had recorded highly accurate observational data about a parallel hominid species. The stories of the hairy men who traded fish for baskets weren't allegories. They were literal historical records of a fragile ancient diplomacy. We had simply lost the ability to read the landscape, trading our deep ancestral connection to the forest for the arrogance of modern science. The truth had always been there, hidden in plain sight, protected by our own stubborn collective refusal to believe our own eyes. My understanding of the wilderness was completely humbled, stripped of the ego that drives men to conquer and categorize every living thing. I looked at the towering Douglas firs and the deep shadowed ravines with a profound, terrifying sense of awe and reverence. The forest wasn't an empty playground waiting to be explored. It was a densely populated, highly organized society, operating just beyond our perception. Every snapped twig, every sudden shift in the wind felt like a deliberate communication in a language I was only just beginning to learn. I was surrounded by an ancient, breathing intelligence that completely defied the sterile clinical definitions of my dusty biology textbooks. As 1995 bled into the following year, the presence of the family became a constant, comforting weight in the back of my mind. I didn't need to see them to know they were there. I could feel the gravity of their existence shaping the entire ecosystem. The mountain felt alive, vibrant and incredibly dangerous, yet I had never felt safer walking the perimeter of my small, isolated clearing. They were the apex guardians of the Chimney, keeping the rogue bears and the desperate, starving cougars far away from my cabin. We existed in a delicate, unspoken symbiosis, completely dependent on the mutual, unbroken promise of absolute, respectful distance. There were nights when the wind died down completely, leaving the valley floor bathed in an eerie, absolute silence that amplified every sound. On those rare, still evenings, I would sometimes hear a low, rhythmic knocking echoing down from the high, unmapped limestone ridges. It was the sound of heavy wood striking solid rock, a percussive, localized broadcast that traveled for miles through the cold, thin air. I would stand on my back porch, gripping the wooden railing, listening to the giants communicating in the dark, vast expanse above me. It was a reminder that the world was infinitely larger and infinitely more complex than the tiny, illuminated square of my cabin window. I knew that as long as I kept the combination to the Diebold safe locked tightly in my head, the knocking would continue. The family was safe, thriving in the treacherous sanctuary of the Cascades, completely unaware of the devastating bullet they had narrowly dodged. But the physical evidence still existed, resting silently in the dark, waiting for the day when I could no longer protect the secret. I often wondered what would happen to the negatives when my time in this valley inevitably came to a quiet, solitary end. The responsibility of the legacy I was leaving behind began to cast a long, heavy shadow over my quiet, reclusive life. It has been over 30 years since that stormy spring night in 1994, and the heavy Diebold safe in my study has remained permanently sealed. I am an old man now, my joints aching with the damp cold that blows down from the high ridges of the Cascades every winter. The Winchester rifle is long gone, replaced by a walking stick carved from a piece of fallen cedar I found near the old game trail. My vision is fading, the sharp clarity of my youth softening into a blurry, quiet acceptance of the things I can no longer control. But the images burned into those strips of 35mm film are as razor-sharp in my memory as the day I pulled them from the chemical bath. I have carried the crushing weight of their existence for decades, acting as the silent, unacknowledged warden of a sanctuary that officially does not exist. The world outside my cabin has changed dramatically, consumed by an endless, noisy march of digital technology and relentless satellite surveillance. Everyone carries a camera in their pocket now, constantly pointing lenses at the forest in a desperate, arrogant attempt to capture every remaining shadow. Yet, the deep, unmapped limestone caves of Devil's Chimney have successfully evaded the drones, the thermal imaging, and the arrogant reach of modern exploration. The family I photographed survived the turn of the century precisely because I chose to bury the definitive proof of their biological reality in the dark. I denied the scientific community their ultimate prize, trading a lifetime of potential fame for the quiet, enduring peace of my towering, silent neighbors. The true legacy of that film isn't the discovery itself, but the deliberate, conscious choice to actively protect the mystery from a destructive world. Sometimes, when the valley is completely blanketed in deep winter snow, I unlock the heavy steel door just to assure myself I wasn't hallucinating. I don't look at the prints often, as the emotional gravity of the images still has the power to completely knock the wind out of me. The silver halides on the negatives are likely beginning to degrade, slowly surrendering the sharp details of the giant's musculature back to the slow decay of time. I find a strange, poetic comfort in the physical deterioration of the evidence, knowing that the secret will eventually dissolve into dust just as I will. The proof is temporary, a fragile artifact of human chemistry, but the lineage surviving in the treacherous peaks above me is ancient and incredibly resilient. They do not need my photographs to validate their existence. They only need my continued, unbroken silence to ensure their future remains secure. I often find myself staring at the very last photograph in the sequence, the one image that completely shatters the illusion of the mindless beast. It is a grainy, high-contrast shot of the adult male standing perfectly still, his massive frame completely filling the perimeter of the 35mm lens. He is no longer walking away or actively shielding the juvenile. He has turned back to face the infrared trigger with terrifying, absolute focus. The sheer, overwhelming intelligence radiating from his deep-set eyes is palpable, projecting a cognitive depth that completely mocks our rigid, arrogant biological classifications. He isn't looking at a strange mechanical box in the woods. He is looking directly through the glass, piercing the veil of the machine to see the man behind it. The connection in that frozen fraction of a second is intimately terrifying, a profound acknowledgement bridging the massive evolutionary gap between our two species. His expression in that final exposure is incredibly difficult to articulate, carrying a heavy, complicated mixture of defiance, deep exhaustion, and quiet sorrow. It is the weary, burdened look of an ancient patriarch who has spent his entire life desperately navigating the ever-shrinking borders of a hostile world. He knows that his kind is being slowly pushed to the absolute edge of existence, forced to hide in the cold, unforgiving cracks of the mountains. There is no feral aggression in his posture, only the heavy, tragic realization that his family's survival depends entirely on remaining a ridiculous campfire myth. I look at the lines of tension around his wide, flat mouth, and I clearly see the immense physical and emotional toll of living as a perpetual ghost. He is a king without a kingdom, holding onto a fragile, dark sanctuary, while the noisy, destructive machinery of humanity constantly circles the perimeter. That specific photograph serves as my daily, humbling reminder that the wilderness still holds secrets far beyond the arrogant limits of our current comprehension. We desperately want to believe that we have catalogued, dissected, and mastered every single breathing organism sharing this planet with us. But the giant staring back at me from the photographic paper is living, breathing proof that our understanding of the natural world is pitifully incomplete. The forest is not a neatly organized museum waiting for us to label its exhibits. It is a vast, terrifyingly deep ocean filled with invisible leviathans. My entire life as a tracker was built on the flawed premise that I could read the woods, but I was only ever skimming the absolute surface. The truth is buried in the deep timber, completely inaccessible to those who refuse to approach the shadows with genuine, quiet reverence. I have made ironclad, legally binding arrangements with my estate attorney regarding the heavy Diebold safe and its volatile, world-breaking contents upon my death. My last will and testament include strict, non-negotiable instructions for the entire vault to be transported to a specialized facility and immediately incinerated, unopened. No archivist, no curious relative, and certainly no ambitious academic will ever have the opportunity to break the seal and unleash the nightmare I prevented. The legacy of the Devil's Chimney photographs will end exactly where it began, reduced to a pile of meaningless, unidentifiable ash in an industrial furnace. It is the final, ultimate gesture of protection I can offer to the family, completely guaranteeing that my inevitable absence won't become their absolute ruin. The burden of the unseen will die with me, officially returning the wildman to the safe, protective realm of local folklore and harmless mountain legends. As my own physical strength wanes, I feel a strange, deep kinship with the weary giant permanently frozen in that final, beautiful black and white frame. We are both aging sentinels, standing guard over our respective sides of the invisible, deeply respected boundary separating the human world from the deep wild. I have spent the last 3 decades actively defending the perimeter from my side, chasing away the trespassers, the hunters, and the arrogant thrill-seekers. In return, the heavy rhythmic knocks still occasionally echo down from the limestone ridges on cold, still nights, letting me know the clan remains entirely secure. We have successfully maintained the fragile, unspoken truce, proving that coexistence is entirely possible when it is built on a foundation of absolute, respectful distance. I am proud to be the unseen warden, the quiet keeper of a majestic truth that the rest of the world is completely unready to handle. The seasons continue to cycle through the valley with ruthless, beautiful efficiency, completely indifferent to the secret pact I made in the darkroom. The winter snows will soon block the access roads again, plunging my isolated cabin into a deep, familiar silence that I have learned to desperately crave. I will stack my firewood, load my heavy cast-iron stove and sit by the frosted window, looking out toward the jagged silhouette of the chimney. I know the massive, dark figures are out there moving through the whiteout, navigating the treacherous terrain with the same impossible, silent grace I photographed. The juvenile from the pictures is likely a towering patriarch himself now, leading a new generation of shadows through the dense, unforgiving labyrinth of the high cascades. The lineage continues, unbroken and incredibly resilient, entirely hidden beneath the thick canopy of ancient cedars and the protective blanket of my enduring silence. There is a profound, terrifying freedom in finally accepting that we are not the ultimate, supreme authority over the dark corners of the earth. Releasing my need to conquer the mystery gave me an incredible sense of peace that I never found while looking through the scope of a rifle. I no longer demand answers from the forest. I simply listen to the low, humming frequency of a world operating completely independent of human influence. The ghosts of the chimney taught me that true power doesn't lie in exposing the unknown, but in possessing the strength to let it remain undisturbed. It is a philosophy that isolates me from my own kind, but firmly connects me to the ancient, beating heart of the mountain I call home. I'm entirely content to fade away in this quiet cabin, leaving the world exactly as mysterious and terrifyingly beautiful as the day I arrived. I often wonder what the giant would think if he knew that the flashing mechanical eye and the stump hadn't been the end of his world. I like to imagine that his weary, knowing look was actually an incredibly desperate, silent plea extended across the vast divide between our species. He was asking for mercy, gambling his entire family's existence on the incredibly slim hope that the man behind the machine possessed a conscience. By locking the safe, I answered that plea, officially honoring the silent treaty proposed in the chaotic, muddy darkness of that spring storm. It is the single greatest achievement of my long, unremarkable life, a completely invisible victory that will absolutely never be celebrated or known by another living soul. The truth is locked in steel, but the reality is alive and breathing in the freezing rain, completely free to roam the hidden ridges forever. The fire in my stove is burning low now, casting long, flickering shadows across the worn, familiar floorboards of my study as the night deepens. Outside, the wind is beginning to howl through the upper canopy, carrying the sharp, metallic scent of an approaching winter storm over the mountain pass. I will leave the porch light off tonight, plunging my small clearing into the absolute comforting darkness that blankets the deep ravines above. As I close my eyes and listen to the timber groaning in the gale, I wait for the familiar echoing sound of wood striking stone. It is an ancient rhythmic heartbeat, reminding us that the deepest woods are never truly empty, waiting for those willing to simply listen. If you believe that the greatest mysteries belong in the shadows, subscribe to the channel and join me next time as we explore the untold secrets of the wild.